Welcome to the follow-up lecture on stress, arousal, and anxiety, where we discuss specific management techniques. We'll take some time to go through the many techniques, but at times it may not be more than a quick description because each technique hasn't necessarily been tested individually. Whenever you're considering using a technique, try to find evidence on it or something quite like it. Also consider the type of person you're thinking of trying it with and their goals or unique problems to solve. A good place to start is with the matching hypothesis, whereby if the symptom you're addressing is somatic or physical, then you would opt to use a physical or somatic type intervention like breathing or muscular relaxation. And if the symptoms are cognitive, then a cognitive-based intervention would be useful. But which happens first, and how do you know which one to address? Anxiety can manifest in physical ways, and we may interpret those signals as negative. So you might say, given it started in the body, that's where we should start. Or thought patterns may be noticed first, and then the fight or flight response kicks in. It's difficult to know, so it may be as simple as making a judgment call and monitoring effects, or even using a combination of interventions. This approach starts with helping athletes become more aware, and this isn't always an easy process. As a coach, I've seen teenagers freeze like a broken computer when asked some of these questions, so there may be a bit of a learning curve to overcome. One of the biggest misconceptions people have is viewing their psychology as something that's out of their control. They go, I feel bad now and I can't do anything about it and it's going to be a bad day. If you can become aware of the things that make you feel negative or likely to feel negative, perhaps the warning signs that you're about to be in a bad state, and you're aware of what to do about that, then you become more empowered to change it. If you couldn't change any of these things, then sports psychologists wouldn't have a job. It might sound gimmicky, but it's a staple of my coaching practice and of many sports psychologists that we're trying to put ourselves out of a job. We are trying to create someone who is their own best psychologist because they have access to all the best information. They experience all of these feelings firsthand, and I can never understand that experience. It's completely unique. So if they're in touch with them, then they're infinitely better at being their own psychologist. Again, here are some typical examples of when people get nervous. And if you go, woe is me, this is out of my control, then you're going to have to suffer. But if you go, what is going through my head and why is that the case? What can I do about it? What can I do to make it better? And do those things on purpose. Chances are those things can be resolved. Some reactions are tied to specific events like walking out or seeing the crowd, and if you can anticipate it, then you can put plans in place to deal with it before it happens. If you know when it happens, then you can plan for it. You can also consider if you have any habits that might set you off. Again, help the athlete become self-aware, empower them to notice it happening and deal with it before it becomes a problem. Realistically, I can't just be running around and saying, okay, you need to think positively. Now try and relax. It needs to be the person doing that for themselves. That's the key to this job. If you're aware of the physical signs, especially the early ones, then you can actually do something about it. I can add clenching your jaw to that list you see here. Tension in and around the head as well. It's a perfectly adaptive response from an evolutionary sense, helping us run or fight in a threatening situation. But in many situations where you have to deliver a very precise skill in a perceived pressured environment, these are no longer useful responses to have. Because we've changed the environment we live in so drastically, these responses are no longer helpful. So the first section looks at how altering the body may influence the mind, but it's worth noting that this is a false distinction. To draw a line somewhere between the body and the mind is unrealistic because they're so inextricably linked. It's incredibly difficult to determine where the body ends and the mind begins. It's not an ideal distinction, but it helps us heuristically think about working upwards from the body or controlling downwards from the mind. One of the considerations for somatic-based training and relaxation is that it takes considerable time to learn and do. If you've ever tried a guided meditation, especially the ones that tell you to trace your way up the body and relax muscles, you've probably found how difficult it is to achieve, despite normally being able to tense your calf whenever you like in other circumstances. But by becoming familiar with the process, you can get to a stage where relaxation happens very quickly, from say half an hour to even just 10 seconds. The trick is creating a process that is so ingrained that you're able to consciously take your anxiety or arousal levels down a few notches. It's not as easy as telling someone to just breathe. There is work to be done in teaching the technique. The outcome and the process become familiar to the athlete, and they create a deeply personal way of controlling their anxiety and arousal. It's not something you can do for them, but you can guide them. You might consider starting this learning process out of season and support the athlete until the process becomes theirs and easy to initiate. A classical technique is simply controlling your breathing, but there are many ways you can approach this. If you happen to have an Apple Watch and you're anything like me, when it pops up with a little notification to tell you to breathe, you probably just swipe it away. But the process and benefits of breathing control are also found in yoga and mindfulness. Short, sharp, shallow breathing can often accompany anxiety. So instead, we want to encourage deeper breathing and control. The technique often used in research is called diaphragmatic breathing, whereby instead of using our intercostal muscles in between the ribs to expand the chest and lungs, we focus on the diaphragm underneath, which sucks in more air. More oxygen in the body means more can go to the muscles and help with performance, but it also brings back some of the control and provides tools to tackle anxiety. After all, athletes are first and foremost human beings. In an article on the TED blog, which are pretty famous for their short talks, the connection between mind, body, and breathing is explored through various pieces of research, highlighting the ripple effects that breathing can have. Here, Professor Alyssa Epple at UC San Francisco links conscious breathing control to controlling the nervous system, which can then help control the symptoms of anxiety. As breathing influences the sympathetic nervous system, which is responsible for our fight or flight response, and the parasympathetic nervous system, which governs resting and digestion, we can encourage the latter to increase our calm and relaxation through breathing techniques. Some of the techniques can also incite hormones like prolactin and possibly oxytocin, which is known as the feel-good hormone associated with love and bonding. There are a variety of techniques which focus on either controlled breathing, depth, or ratios. There are few studies out there on each particular type, but understanding the differences between them helps you interpret the meaning of those studies, how they contribute to our knowledge of sports psychology, and if/when you would recommend them to athletes. Complete breathing uses the diaphragm, as mentioned before, and it's a good place to start. The idea is that you're able to take control and overcome that instinct to breathe quickly and shallow, something that is reinforced everywhere, including in filmmaking, where they make sure you can hear the panting of the person being chased just to make you feel more nervous as you watch. It's similar to other learning processes like proprioception, where you learn where your body is in space. Learning to control your breathing takes time and awareness, but it can disrupt that anxious response in moments if athletes are invested. This is slightly different from just sighing normally out of annoyance, which I'm sure we're all guilty of sometimes, often while listening to sports commentary for someone like me. The difference here is that breath is held for a number of seconds, and the focus of relaxation occurs during the exhale rather than afterwards, almost like expelling the tension in the body as the sigh leaves your mouth. It might sound weird if you're trying to do these techniques as you follow along to this lecture, but I encourage you to try them and see how they feel, or imagine how an athlete would feel if you got them to try it. There are physiological responses to breathing in and out with fluctuating pressure around the rib cage and changes in heart rate. So we're trying to harness these processes to our advantage with breathing as the remote control. Rhythmic breathing is actually becoming more popular now with the prevalence of anxiety management and mindfulness apps. Even the Apple Watch notification I spoke about earlier uses little pulses and breaks to tell you when to breathe in, hold, and breathe out. This little GIF on the side is very easy to find and encourages you to follow the rise and the fall of the shapes so you can focus on something rather than just counting. You can even use a specific ratio where breathing out is longer than breathing in to really slow things down. But starting small is key with something like inhaling for 4 and exhaling for 8. As you get more familiar and confident in your breathing, then that ratio can extend to 5 and 10 or 6 and 12. If done well, this can be a very powerful relaxer and is often encouraged for a few minutes each day for people who find it difficult to carve out time to meditate. But again, this is only anecdotally, so before we go recommending it to clients, we need to ensure there is an evidence base behind it and establish why it's considered a powerful relaxer. This is taken from concepts like meditation, where you're encouraged to find your proverbial center. Here, breathing is harnessed as a tool for focus, and positive thoughts are overlaid with the calming effect of the breath. Common cues when inhaling confidence is in with the good, out with the bad. But again, the breathing comes from the diaphragm and the exhale is slow. It may be a script that you can construct with your athlete, but the layers are the key element of this specific approach to breathing. Relaxation techniques are often multifaceted with multiple things going on, and we could divide them into breathing and muscular relaxation and then subdivide into types of breathing as we've done here, but evidence for specific types are often integrated with other approaches, and that makes it difficult to establish the effects clearly. Having a layered response which can be personalized to each athlete could be very useful. This is a very popular technique, and it was first suggested by Jacobson in 1930. But the idea is that you work around the body and relax different muscle groups at a time and end up being as relaxed as you can possibly be physically. In your muscles, at least. This normally comes with a script that contains the idea of tensing the muscles first and then relaxing them and shaking out any remaining tension in them. This is also an element of yoga, being able to identify areas of tension in the body as you move through movements and what that might be telling you. Classically, you begin from far away from the body, all the way at the toes, and work your way up the leg muscles to begin with. Again, with practice, the process becomes quite familiar. It gets reasonable support and evidence, and I recommend you review that, but it does take some time. The goal might be to help the athlete scan the body and relax any areas of tension. Or you may like to skip the tensing phase and use only muscle relaxation. Differential PMR is where you tense the whole body at once and then release piece by piece until the end point is the athlete knows how to feel relaxed of their own volition and they no longer need to be guided through it. And of course, passive PR is where you don't tense the muscles at all and simply aim to relax any areas of tension. Many people find this more relaxing than active PR, where you tense the muscles first and move your way up the body as before, and would likely require less learning to achieve relaxation. In relation to anxiety, tension is often found in the neck and shoulders, so it may be worth focusing energy there. It might be more beneficial to simply ask the athlete where they feel tension as they become more aware and target those areas instead. As each person is unique, they may carry tension in different places. For example, I often find myself clenching my jaw and don't realize I'm doing it until I consciously unclench it and wonder why my jaw was hurting. The people who are unfamiliar or struggling to tense or relax areas further away from the brain, a nearby muscle group might be a good place to start. The practicality of the techniques and the time that it takes to become familiar with them is something you need to take into consideration when working with an athlete. Again, remembering our matching hypothesis, these thinking approaches are matched to cognitive anxiety. There are a variety of techniques when looking to target cognitive anxiety, ranging from meditation and visualization to almost a type of self-hypnosis in the school of thought of autogenic training. These techniques are often thrown into a melting pot together and thrown at athletes, so we need to understand their unique approaches, what they're designed to achieve, and any relevant evidence to suggest that they do. It is also important to note that different approaches work for different people, so having a breadth of knowledge can better equip you to support your athletes. There is a physical side of meditation, but the mental side is all about relaxing and quieting the mind, which many people can struggle to do. It's classically associated to some religions, but is now widely practiced independently, focusing on relinquishing control of your thoughts and allowing them to slip away, ending up with, hopefully, what is called a quiet mind. You can sometimes detect this in someone's eye movements, where they make fewer fixations in circumstances and in brainwaves. People will often move towards what's called the alpha pattern, where all other types of brainwaves tend to have gone quiet. It's an indication that you're mindfully relaxed and not trying to control your thinking. The basic approach from Benson is to find somewhere quiet, adopt a comfortable position, have some kind of core mental device like a thought you'd like to return to or a mantra, and be passive about other thoughts as they come and go. The idea of that is to become very familiar and individually connected with the technique, but this takes time to learn. Imagery has been used in many other ways around skill learning, confidence, and motivation, but one of the other ways is controlling anxiety and arousal. There's two approaches. You can have a happy place where your mind goes to, picturing a scene that you find relaxing. It's a nice idea. It's almost a helpful distraction to transport an athlete into a more relaxed state despite the current environmental demands. Imagery can also be used very specifically. For example, if you imagine the tension in your body as a liquid, a hot, bubbly liquid that you want to get rid of, and the tips of your fingers and toes are taps, then you can imagine that tension literally draining from your body and being replaced by something calmer or soothing or cool. Again, the idea is to be able to do this quickly when it matters, but there is a significant learning curve. Here is a quick example of a happy place image. For me, it's somewhere like the beach, and you would take some time recreating that image to its fullest detail in your mind, which may include physical aspects as well, like being able to dig in your toes in the sand or the sound of waves slapping on the shore. This is a very personal approach and something you cannot do for them, but some guiding questions might come in handy. Some athletes may even find that being in the competitive environment is incredibly relaxing because it symbolizes the hard work they've done to get there, culminating in one moment. It may not seem like a relaxing environment, but it serves the purpose of relaxing the person. The autogenic training idea is that we create the sense of contentment or safety, focusing on physical sensations like warmth and heaviness as a relaxing sensation rather than tension. You often hear it in hypnosis scripts where they suggest that your limbs feel very heavy and that you can't move them. And that suggestion may be enough to encourage the person to relax and not try to control their body. It's very deliberate and intentional, and we classify it as a cognitive intervention, but there are physical elements, sensations, and perceptions which highlights the difficulty of separating the mind from the body. Because it comes with a script, there are often stages to move through where you start with heaviness in the limbs, a feeling of warmth, your heartbeat slowing down, and slowing down your breathing as well. For those of you that don't know where the solar plexus is, it's located in the abdomen where a large network of nerves converges. So we encourage a sense of warmth there to radiate through the body while the forehead remains cool and calm. Designing a script that is individualized for the athlete is still key here, one that they could potentially memorize to speed up the process. Being entirely relaxed may not be the most useful state for performance, so it might be that you design stages of relaxation with the athlete to complement the performance environment and demands in a key moment like kicking for goal. Just as we spoke about layering interventions earlier, visualization can be tied to autogenic training as well to create a multifaceted approach to supporting the athlete. The regulating factor here is how the athlete wants to feel when they're competing and in certain moments of competition. So this is the barometer you're working around and towards. This approach is relatively new and builds on the idea of autogenic training where you're trying to control your heartbeat and breathing. It is possible to control these things and assumes they're under our control most of the time. If we offer someone feedback about their breathing rate, heart rate, brain waves, sweating, you can begin to control those things. If someone trains to take a lie detector test, all they're doing is using biofeedback to hide certain signs or symptoms from the machine. It's becoming increasingly popular and even games now where if you produce more alpha brain waves, then you move the ball on a table towards an opponent's goal. It's actually something we're beginning to explore in more detail and getting better at using. There's some initial research suggesting that these things can be trained, and that's useful for our athletes who need to become familiar with how these things feel. It's an option, and if we had the money, then we could think about using it with each athlete or maybe short-term training and reflect on how they manage to achieve any potential changes. The whole point really is empowering the athlete to be able to identify when they need to use it. So biofeedback has been used in clinical settings for chronic anxiety or illness. Again, the idea is that you're showing your live performance on a computer screen or a live graph, and you're encouraged to try and control it, which may be entirely trial and error to begin with, but then you gradually learn that if I control my breathing, then my heartbeat changes. Or if I use a particular thought, my brain waves change, or whatever it might be. It's that closer integration of the mind and body. Again, the fact that they're all part of the same machine that exists very closely together. So the chance of being able to control them should be there. But we often think that because we can't do it immediately and easily, that it's not possible. Even back in 1988, this looked promising. And you can even get vests now which relay this information as someone is training. You could even give them feedback live while they're on the bike or out in the field. Classic cognitive techniques usually come from clinical settings and schools of thought which look to change the way a person appraises the situation. Remember that our definition of stress is based on the perceived demand of a situation, and that outweighs a person's perceived ability to cope. This perception is cognitive, and even then they have to perceive a consequence of failing, so it's a lot of thought. It could be that we change people's interpretation of the demands of the situation, coping resources, or consequences of failing and succeeding, and that can be very useful to say. Generally, we focus on rephrasing or restructuring, for example. Restructuring looks at retraining the way somebody interprets things. Structuring is quite integral. You're talking about a big change in how people interpret events, and it's drawn from the rational emotive technique, which can be done with athletes or in a clinical setting. In clinical situations, their anxiety is causing severe problems to the point where a person's quality of health is being affected. Whereas with athletes, it's less that they can't go on and live, but it's preventing them from doing their best. And there might be some differences in the way we use this technique as a result. You'll often find that athletes have an irrational or exaggerated need for perfection or to get things right, and sometimes it's unreasonable. We say, why do you have this thought or core belief? Or is failure really bad? Is it a part of eventually succeeding? So we need to change the way somebody thinks about it, and that's hard and it takes time. Someone can suggest that you need to think differently about it, and it doesn't always stick. You might need to add a layer of not only new thoughts, but tracking how current thoughts are affecting you, and that's increasingly difficult. It may even take a diary, which is extra hassle for the athlete, so it becomes more than just have a thought and we'll fix it. It's about, can you have those other thoughts? Are they helping? Hopefully, building in this ability to detect what is working and what is not can help athletes identify what is helpful and useful to them. Because they're quite ingrained, people will become very attached to irrational beliefs like perfection or being unable to cope. So we need to demonstrate that irrational beliefs are leading to distorted thinking, to change those beliefs. If we can change them or substitute these thoughts and beliefs for something more functional, then hopefully those behaviors will change as well. This is a very difficult thing to do in one session, and when people are looking for a quick fix in psychology, this is where they often go wrong. This kind of intervention will take some time in the same way that the relaxation process is difficult to learn. This provides athletes with a whole new way of thinking, and that can be really difficult to reconcile or believe in or even try immediately. Despite there being so many techniques, they don't always work for a variety of reasons. It may be that the person doesn't trust you, and when you're talking about how someone thinks about the world, then that's a massive change. If there was a drug that did that, you'd want to give some consent before you're given it. So sometimes we throw around these recommendations without pausing to think if the person wants to make this kind of change. Often it is more than just their sporting performance. It might actually affect the rest of their life as well. We want to have a core of trust, knowing that the person can choose to do this and seek help and be supported in that process. We also know that insufficient practice is quite common in that they try to use a technique without sufficient practice, and when it doesn't work, it's attributed to the nature of the technique itself rather than its application. This is often seen in psychological skills training in sports, where a program is run during the preseason, maybe without the full support of the coaching staff, and it's seen as a secondary, almost interruption, rather than complementary to their physical skills training. Becoming self-aware is also an important part of the learning process, and without this awareness, it is difficult to successfully implement many of these techniques when they might be most suitable. Similarly, if the technique is forced or not used at an appropriate time without the triggers or symptoms that it's designed to target, then the effects of the approach may be limited. Some people also don't like to relinquish control, and some of the breathing exercises and relaxation exercises may not be suitable. While it's important to understand why this underlying factor exists eventually, it may not be within your time constraints. Meditation can be difficult for anxious people or overthinkers, so connecting with the athlete and their intervention experience is always important. There are also people who say that they can relax, but not under pressure, and that's entirely understandable. While building a skill away from pressure seems logical, reintroducing pressure and environmental demands which challenge these skills should be gradually introduced to help athletes adapt their new skills to the environment they want to use them in. You won't be able to use the skill under pressure immediately, so introducing it to training environments and building that skill, just like any other skill, is necessary. You may also have to manage the expectations of the athletes and their coaches, who often liken psychological skills training to learning a new pattern of play or kicking a ball, despite their vast difference. You might as well judge a volleyballer or a basketballer on their ability to take a drop kick. There's also ironic processing, whereby trying to relax actually has the opposite effect. Like knowing you have to go to sleep and get up early in the morning, so you sit there wide awake all night. Part of managing expectations is making sure people know it's okay to have these ironic and contradictory thoughts, and we can manage them rather than thinking, I can't do this is not my thing. If you're working with athletes, many of these techniques we've discussed use scripts or structure, so it's worth developing a base that you're familiar with and can personalize for each athlete. If you're using the script live, you may need to practice the pacing to create a soothing and slow or clear progression that can be adjusted based on the athletes or the session. Similarly to personal training, while they dedicate their entire session to fitness training, you should be able to dedicate a whole session to working on psychological skills without being afraid to do so. There needs to be some guidance for athletes to pursue or continue self-directed approaches and programs. This support can come as supporting documents or recordings, but ultimately, you want athletes to identify their signs and symptoms. Adherence also needs monitoring too. There may be some athletes who say it didn't work, but also didn't practice, and if that were any other skill, the outcome would likely be the same. So assuming we match cognitive anxiety to cognitive interventions and somatic anxiety to somatic interventions, here is a quick summary of existing evidence for some of those techniques, focusing on the physiological/somatic interventions. Moore's PhD really attacked this to see if these things really work. The focus on randomized control trials, or RCT in the design column, is because that's the gold standard of science. So it's the same level of evidence that medicine uses, where two groups are randomly selected without bias, and they don't know whether they have the intervention or the placebo. We wanted sports athletes too, so the bottom half of the screen looks at undergrads, and they're out. The manual refers to whether the experiment can be repeated with enough information to run exactly the same thing. And if you haven't provided that, then it's a waste of time because it's not even science. It's literally just a story. So it's worth really pushing hard at that door, especially as students, of whether the evidence supports the claims that we make. Because you get the strong impression from YouTube videos, textbooks, overzealous psychologists that this works. This will make you perform better as an athlete. And I would generally argue it could. I understand how it would and may have seen it happen, but I cannot, with a good conscience, promise you that it will help. And then you come back in a few weeks thinking psychology is nonsense. That's a huge open goal for you. Plus, how do we ever give advice to someone when this is the best that we've got? From the evidence here, with athletes and quality design, the effects of relaxation did not differ from control. So how can we rely on these interventions without evidence to support them? It doesn't mean you can't use them if you properly tailor these approaches for the athletes you're working with and their goals. But just keep this in mind. Just to address a recent trend, these buzzwords are something you probably come across. And I remember being in a special research group as a primary school student, which looked at the effects of resilience in the classroom. When reviewing stress, anxiety, and arousal, we've spoken about coping resources, which is how much does a person believe they can cope with or perceive they can cope with. And we are often quite pessimistic in our evaluation of coping resources until bad things happen and we realize we're capable of more than we thought. People are remarkable copers, and unfortunately, it takes something really bad for us to realize that. When you focus on resilience, there is a class of people who are not stressed out by what other people may be worried about and seem to just carry on. So whether it's called hardiness, mental toughness, or resilience, there's something where they may not perceive the stimulus as a problem, or they appear to just cope fine. There are growing projects around mental fitness and resilience with diaries that even give you prompts or quotes each day and goals per month to help you build these coping resources in a similar way to self-guided psychological skills training. If you're curious about what these look like, check out the Resilience Agenda. Drawing from positive psychology, people appear to be very confident in their skill set and say, I can cope, no problem. I'll be here afterwards and we'll just get on with it. There's a school of thought that maybe the best approach is to not become aroused or anxious in the first place. And this is something that Stoicism is largely based on as well. Using the teachings of ancient philosophers like Seneca, Epictetus, or Marcus Aurelius, they speak about controlling the mind, something we often forget we can do, and directing our energy towards our clear goals in life. Worrying, being anxious, and controlling things we cannot control are depicted as a waste of energy, time, and our own mental resources. Another key element is our interpretation of symptoms. John McEnroe famously said in an interview that he doesn't see getting anxious before a game as a bad thing. Instead, it's a signal that he's ready to compete. There are other anecdotal accounts of swimmers being told that nerves are a bad thing. So when they're on the blocks and feeling nervous, they think they're not ready. They shouldn't be there and perform accordingly. The problem here in terms of establishing evidence is that rather than there being a problem and we're treating it in this way, we're essentially preventing a problem from happening in the first place, and it's difficult to measure that. If you do want to look into this, there are some key authors in the final point of the slide and a number of papers under research evidence in the last few slides of this presentation. So, in an attempt to summarize, there are so many approaches and techniques to manage anxiety and arousal, but trying to reduce anxiety once it's happened may be too late. It's better to reduce it happening in the first place. Where we do have these techniques, the results in the research are quite mixed, which is discouraging in one way, but then you have to realize that maybe we need to be personalizing things more to each athlete, each sport, and their unique situation. Plus, the new idea that we should prepare people to avoid or cope with stress, anxiety, and arousal before it ever becomes a problem, whereby making it difficult to capture the effects of these approaches. It might be that we can inoculate people from becoming stressed or anxious in the first place, and that's important. This converges with mental toughness research because there's no clear dividing line, and you'll find this happens with many psychological concepts as we approach them from various perspectives. So I hope that's been informative, but this is just the start, so I encourage you to keep digging, stay curious and critical, and understand the potential impact of your recommendations when working with athletes.